thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Judy Mark. I am president of Disability Voices United, and I am a, okay, there we go. I am a parent of a 23-year-old son who sometimes uses various modes of communication. And so I am really excited to welcome you all to this webinar. This webinar we're calling The Right to Learn, a webinar on student rights to receive communication and other supports during the pandemic. We decided to do this webinar for a couple of reasons. First of all, Disability Voices United and Disability Rights California co-lead a project in the state of California called the Communication Disability Access Network, where we work with organizations across disabilities to inform them on student and adult rights to communication access and those different funding agencies that should be providing this access. We have we also partner with Communication First, a really amazing national organization that fights for people's rights to communication. And about a month ago, they sent out this extraordinary toolkit on students' rights to communication during the pandemic. And I'm like, we got to do a webinar on that. And so we immediately reached out to Tana Shmansky, the executive director and legal director, and she said, hell yeah, as long as we can also do it in Spanish. And so we're like, absolutely. So we're so thrilled that she agreed to join us. So for everyone, I forgot to actually explain the language in English. Sorry, everyone. So if you are just joining us and you would like to use Spanish interpretation, hopefully you're understanding us, you can go down to the interpretation link on your phone, on your iPad, or on your computer and click on Spanish. If you are not requiring the simultaneous interpretation, then please click English. It's really important that you also choose mute original audio, particularly if you're using the Spanish interpretation. All right, so we are going to get started. Our first presenters are not the lawyers. They're not the experts from the sort of rights perspective. They're the experts because they're the users. They're the ones who are the students and family members who we are hearing from, who are facing tremendous barriers to receiving the kinds of supports that they need during the pandemic when school is primarily being done virtually. And we have with us William Del Rosario, who is a user of augmentative and assistive technology and communication. And he is going to tell us a bit with support from his mom, Michelle, who will also be presenting sort of her perspective as a parent fighting for the rights of her son on how they've been doing during the pandemic. So William, thank you for joining us. Go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. Let me just start sharing our screen. And I need to get right there. Okay. So we decided to do the format of our presentation in just asking William to pre-answer some questions because it does take him some time to type out his responses. So we asked him a few questions and we thought we'd share a little bit or co-present together on this. And the first question we asked William was how his virtual learning during the pandemic has been impacted by his ability to access education. So before we start, I thought I'd maybe give you a little bit of background on what pre-COVID education looked like for him. He is a 20-year-old student finishing his high school and transition. And he had an IEP with full supports. I'm a big proponent of making sure that we have everything in our IEP checked off as far as services and supports, because we're always told as parents that they can promise a service, but not necessarily a person. And boy, am I thankful that we did some of that. However, as we got into COVID times, the playing field has changed, as many of us have experienced. But some of the things Williams had in his IEP pre-COVID was that he had a one-on-one behavior support aide who also served or had the role of serving as his communication partner. However,
Michelle, I am so sorry to interrupt. One of the interpreters has asked you to slow down a little bit just to make it easier for her to interpret.
Sure thing. Sure
Sorry
thing.
about that.
Sorry. So services that we had before COVID, we had his educational placement, which is high school in transition. We had speech services. We had occupational therapy services. And also a one-on-one aide who was supposed to be his communication partner. A missing piece we had pre-COVID was that we didn't have an AAC provider to provide the service just yet. We had literally the month before signed the contract with the provider who was going to come in and train our team. She did, I think, 2 sessions, and then the shutdown happened here in California. So as many people in the country experienced, we moved to a virtual learning platform and kind of found our way. You can see in the picture here, we set up at the dining room table and just got started with trying to make the best of it, thinking it was going to be a temporary situation, but it ended up being a little bit longer than that, obviously. So I'm going to have William share some insight he has about the supports, environment, his communication partner, and navigating a virtual platform.
My access to education has changed greatly. Think about it. I went from a classroom with full support to sitting at a computer and viewing my teacher through a screen. Not having full supports has been difficult. There are many things competing with my attention. I am getting used to a new environment, but the reality is I still need to have a communication partner. Maybe even more so now. My mom helps some of the time, but not all. The school team has trouble understanding that I cannot type independently all of the time. I definitely need help getting through Zoom, turning pages and making the actions and movements they want me to do.
Okay. So a little bit more about that. As William mentioned, he had trouble making the movement, things like we've all experienced here on Zoom, remembering to unmute and mute yourself when it's appropriate, getting feedback when there are multiple participants, like there were when the whole class was virtual learning, accommodating that. William can write, and so sometimes he would write on paper, but they aren't able to necessarily see that. So we use things like the whiteboard and some other technology accommodations. And then giving feedback to the team was really important from a parent's point of view, so that they knew what he was seeing on his side of the screen. He has a 13-inch monitor on his laptop, and where he was, in a full 360 view in the classroom, just having that limited screen access to what he's doing and him seeing what they're doing was very different for us all. Go ahead.
I think learning more about how my body needs support and how to teach me using the strategies to meet my motor help, not the simplifying of academics. For example, in math, we moved on from trying to teach me to line up decimals to using a talking calculator for algebra. My mom came up with the technology ideas. We also need to think about regulation and how my body has been giving me trouble with making adjustments to a computer instead of a person. For example, I needed to learn how to raise my hand or write my answer on a whiteboard using multiple choice.
And just a little bit more for parents who are maybe newer on their journey, I can't stress enough the importance of parent training. if you have an AAC provider or you're seeking AAC usage, make sure that you somehow get involved in that, whether you write it into your IEP or if you're doing private therapy, that you're kind of immersed in that, because it was really helpful for me to be able to think of learning strategies for William that we could flex with as we moved into this virtual platform. The next question we asked William was, what supports has your school provided while you've been learning from home? This has been something that's been evolving. We, are always learning as we're growing with his curriculum, what he's going to need. And then as a parent, it's up to me to advocate for that. And either if we have to have an IEP or informally through emails, get those accommodations put in and working on the supports. Go ahead.
At first, we had group instruction for 1 hour a day with the whole class on Zoom. The aides were not there. Eventually, they returned, but it was not the same. They did not have a way to help regulate me. Shouting out, "Good job," is nice, but I need more help than that. Sometimes the aide is on Zoom silently watching. Mom was my communication partner, and the school team was able to see how much I could do with a trained partner. Communication gives me the same chance as everyone else. I also received books. Mom had to advocate for me to have them create paper copies of the book because it is too heavy to work with. I have speech and occupational therapy online. I am waiting for my AAC support to come in. The challenge will be having the training done on Zoom. I need someone with me to practice, and my aide can't do that through a screen.
So a little bit more. At this point, we had worked from March through the summer because William goes to school nearly year round. And we had the same teacher. She retired at the end of August. His one-on-one moved on to a different field of work. And we had a whole new team start in September. And we went from the 1 hour of instruction time that William mentioned, thinking that it was temporary, to a full day. And William still did not have a support person here at home with him other than me when I can fill in between work. So the expectation from the team is that he will navigate through his school day independently, which if you are familiar with letterboards, William uses a couple of them. You see them in the picture there, the QWERTY keyboard, his letterboard, and then he also uses a keyboard on a mount. He can use those. Some of them work really well with Zoom. Others, such as the QWERTY and the letterboards, do not. And then there's the fatigue factors. 6 hours a day of typing is fatiguing for anybody. So there are times where he needs his communication support person to help regulate him and coach his motor. It's evolving. Some positives that we've had, as William mentioned, is that with me being his trained communication partner, whereas we had a team in February who believed in William and was starting to shift their mindset to presuming competence, and all of the wonderful things that come with a open communicator or an AAC communicator in accessing academics. We didn't have the training. And so them seeing that, William opening up to them has been a positive. However, unfortunately, I can't be his full-time support person. And we're really struggling right now with doing things virtually. It's not quite working out, and we're problem solving for that. The next question we asked William is, tell us what it feels like to be alone on a Zoom meeting and know that you really could do more if you had support. So we opted in for virtual learning when California or our county opened up their schools. It made sense for our family to do that. But William is one of, I think, 2, maybe 3 students in his class who are doing the virtual learning option. And he's also on a different academic path than some of his peers. So we've struggled with that in addition to the staff changes I mentioned.
We decided to do virtual learning when school reopened. This means I am not able to see the other students in class during morning group. The teacher and my aide are with me alone for my other subjects in Zoom, but most of the session is spent trying to get me to initiate. Sometimes I can get a few words, but it is slow. The hard thing is being taught separately. It is lonely.
Yeah, so we're really peeling back those layers for the social emotional part. We worked really hard throughout William's lifespan, getting him social, getting him out in the community, and working on all of those challenges that come with autism. And he was doing quite well with it. And even in the initial virtual platform, when the entire class was on, we could see them. Currently, due to HIPAA concerns, his school is not allowing him to see the other students, and they aren't allowed to necessarily see him. We can hear faintly the audio, and again, something that we're troubleshooting with the team.
This has been so hard, but getting the team to grow will be the victory.
Yeah, and this picture kind of says it all. This is what we strive for and what we're working for. We love the smiles. We love the independent typing. Anybody that uses AAC or has an AAC user in their life knows how difficult this can be to independently do full time, but you know, it's something we strive for, and we're going to keep working with our team as best we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hey, William, you are like a role model for so many other students. And I know that this pandemic has been hard for so many people, and particularly for those folks who are typing and who need communication partners. And so, and what a badass mom you have, William. So that's awesome. I wanted to just tell everybody in the audience that you have various ways to ask questions to our presenters. The first way you can do it is to put it in the chat. And I have a couple that I just want to broach to you, William. But there's also, you could also put it in the Q&A, and you'll find the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. It actually says Q&A and has two little kind of word bubbles, thought bubbles above it. And I'll be monitoring both of those and presenting those questions to our panelists. So before we move on, there was a couple quick questions for you, William and Michelle. Someone wanted to know what AAC device you were using.
So is it okay if I answer this for you, Will? Yeah, okay. So William uses, well, this is a change we had. We were using Proloquo to go with typing mode, but we've been wanting to move to Proloquo for text. So we made it kind of a new choice for William. He uses that app on an iPad. For his presentation, what we use is a sister app in the assistive wear family called Pictello. And we will often, when we do presentations, create a PowerPoint, and then I pair the slides to Pictello and William types the text because it has the same voice in there.
That's great. A parent is saying that her son needs help finding the most suitable device for communication, and she wants to know where her son can get such help. How did you get started with this? Where do you even start as a parent?
So William was born, well, he's 20, he was born in 2000. So there were not iPads as early as 10 years ago. And we started with PECs and the usual things that, you know, you used back then. There were dedicated devices, which were not very user friendly some of the time, and they were bulky. And then a friend told me about the iPad. So we were in a time with our IEP then where they wanted to stay with the PECs, or maybe didn't believe in William's cognitive abilities. So we made a family choice to purchase iPad and Proloquo to go. In hindsight, that was just kind of, he was one of the first generation users. So it was a new thing. We didn't know if it was going to work, but it was money we were willing to invest. And it really was probably some of the best autism dollars we ever spent for our family. In hindsight, I always recommend that a family goes and gets a good quality AAC assessment. There are so many AAC apps and options now that it's hard to say which one would be the right one. We really struck gold with that being the right one for William. It doesn't mean that it's right for everybody. So that's where I would start. I don't know. I think Communication First may have some resources. There's another group called I-ASC like cat, Wellspring, or even some districts have really good AAC providers. Not all, but some do. So start with your district maybe.
So Michelle, if I could ask you a favor, that while the next presenter goes on, if you could put some of these ideas in the chat that I ask, because I know that that's spelled a little unusually, so that people can get get some ideas, any websites you have or any organizations, that would be great. All right, so hang on with us. If you can, William, if you need to take a break, we totally get it. And we're going to move on to our next presenter. Our next presenter, I was telling you about her earlier. Tana Szymanski is the Executive Director and Legal Director of Communication First, which is a pretty new organization, but a year and a half maybe now, that is a national organization based in the Washington, D.C. area that really fights for the rights of people who need communication access. And really is the inspiration for this event today. They have developed a communication toolkit for students. So take it away, Tana.
Okay, let me share my screen and make sure that works. Is that visible?
It's moving a little slow, but there it is. It's perfect.
Okay. Thank you so much, Judy. And thank you so much, William and Michelle. I'm really happy we had a concrete example to start out with. So that's not so abstract. So, all right. You're right, it is slow. There we go. Very quickly about us, Communication First, as Judy mentioned, just launched about a year ago. We are the only national nonprofit organization dedicated to the estimated 5 million people in the United States of all ages who are unable to rely on speech alone to be heard and understood. We are focused on civil rights and interests of this population. We're a cross-disability organization, meaning we focus on anyone who can't rely on speech to be understood regardless of the cause. And we're also run by and for people with disabilities. Our focus is really on ensuring access both to communication, but to really everything else in society, and to promoting equity, justice, inclusion, and opportunity in really any field out there, but including education, healthcare, community living, employment, criminal justice, and other domains. And our work falls into 3 primary areas. The first is public education and engagement. The second is working on reforming policy and practice. And the third is focused on direct advocacy, systemic litigation. So as Judy mentioned, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Know Your Virtual Access Rights Toolkit that is also in Google slide format. I'm not going to be presenting all 60 some slides of that. It's in that format for accessibility purposes. But the link is here, and I don't know if that can be put in the chat or something, but it's on our website, and folks can access the full sort of background that has some legal language in it and some more detail in it. So I'm just going to be covering the highlights. So we're going to answer 4 sort of key questions today. First, what kind of students are we talking about with this toolkit? Is it discrimination when a school district denies in-person student supports during virtual learning? We'll talk about, is it possible to safely provide in-person supports in the student's home or elsewhere? and what are the realistic options for supporting students like William during virtual learning during the pandemic. So who are we talking about? So this is a group of students who have very significant disabilities. Due to the nature of their disabilities, most of these students are people who need full-time in-person assistance, really to access any kind of learning. So before the pandemic, students in this category tended to have either a full-time dedicated one-to-one aide, or they were placed in a very low adult student ratio, sort of 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 classroom, where they were in effect getting full-time in-person supports. During the pandemic, what this means, or even before, they tend to need assistance just turning on the iPad, turning on the tablet, logging in, using a mouse, toggling between various screens, and sort of staying seated and alert at the table. They also tend to need assistance, as William does, and virtually all AAC users, especially students, need some kind of human support to access their AAC, whether that's troubleshooting it, turning it on, making sure it's connected to the virtual learning environment, managing the multiple screens that are involved in engaging in virtual learning, and muting and unmuting and all of that. So really full-time in-person supports are needed just to access any kind of learning. And this is proven because beforehand they tended to have that as well. So this is also a group of students who typically cannot wear masks due to their disability. Some can, but it's very difficult for many students in this group. And also people who, due to their disabilities, have difficulty following, very rigorous hygiene and safety protocols, maintaining 6 feet of distance, washing your hands for 20 seconds, wearing face shields or gloves or anything like that. And critically, this group is also, we now know, in a high COVID-19 risk category. So there's been a fair amount of research just in a fairly short period of time about the greater likelihood of people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, which is the majority of people who have IEPs, and especially folks in this category of folks who have significant support needs. So there's a variety of statistics, but the studies say different things, but they all say that there's a greater likelihood of mortality, death, if you get COVID, right? If you have intellectual or developmental disabilities. So in the toolkit, these are hyperlinked if you want to see the original sources, but in some it's sort of ranges from 2 to 16 times more likely to die if you get COVID if you have an intellectual or developmental disability. So what are school districts doing around the country? I think everyone knows there's a wide range of models right now. Some districts are all virtual all the time for every single student. Believe it or not, there are still some districts that are actually all in person in a school. And then some are blend or hybrid, different terms are used. And then a lot of schools are sort of going back and forth between some of these as metrics change and infection rates change. For school districts that are offering any type of in-school instruction, most districts are offering families some kind of choice, right? So we'll offer some kind of instruction, but families, if you're uncomfortable sending your child in, you can be virtual if you want. So I'm going to encourage you to sort of think about what the baseline is in your district for what the school district is offering to families without disabilities. So if your neighbor down the street, your next door neighbor, let's say, is a student who of similar age who doesn't have a disability, what is being offered to them in terms of accessing their instruction? So in that, I'm encouraging you to think about that, because the framing here for this brief talk is really going to be focused less on what you're probably more familiar with, which is the IDEA sort of services framework that gives you an IEP and special education and services, less on that and more on the framework that is embraced in the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is really about leveling the playing field, and giving equal access, ensuring equal access to people with disabilities. The ADA mandates that people with disabilities, including students, are afforded equal access and equal opportunities. So when we're talking about equal, you have to sort of compare it to what other people are getting, what kind of opportunities are they being given. And so the baseline in effect is, what are students without disabilities being given in terms of educational opportunities, in terms of access? And so it's important to sort of always think about what are other people getting, and and let's sort of start that conversation there. So the other way to sort of think about this, if you haven't sort of thought about disability in terms of this framework, in terms of equal access and from sort of an equity perspective, is a lot of people, when they think of the ADA, they think about wheelchair ramps, and that's certainly one of the more famous things that the ADA has allowed. But that analogy is a good one, because people have a visual image of, well, the ADA was what gave us curb cuts and sidewalks and wheelchair ramps to get in schools. But it's a nice analogy, because what we're talking about here is in-person supports, really, for students like William and others who rely on AAC and need full-time in-person supports. In-person supports for them are similar to a wheelchair ramp in that they are necessary for the students to get in the door of virtual learning. So it is comparable. The in-person supports are comparable, sort of theoretically in your head, to a wheelchair ramp or a curb cut. So they can't enter the school building, they can't enter virtual learning without those in-person supports. So essentially the need that we're addressing with this toolkit, and we're trying to address, is that if a school district is not providing those in-person supports that are necessary for a student to access virtual instruction, or the type of instruction it's offering to all other students, it is denying that student access to a public education. And by doing so, that is discrimination on the basis of disability. So another key thing that's really motivating this is an equity perspective, right? So what we've seen throughout the country is families who are able will have a parent, both parents working from home. One parent is able to take leave or quit their job and be essentially a full-time unpaid paraprofessional to support their student to access virtual learning, or they were able to find someone to hire to come in and provide that role, or they have Medicaid to do that. But what we're really concerned about are the families that don't have that kind of privilege, right? So what about all the families who aren't able to telework, where there's a single parent who has to keep working, or for families who can't afford to quit their jobs to be full-time unpaid paraprofessionals? They really, one, don't have any choice in the matter, and two, we're hearing some horror stories about neglect, essentially, of students who aren't getting any education at all during this time. So another way to sort of think about the sort of discrimination analysis is to ask about whether students with disabilities are, so what we're seeing is students with disabilities are being told that the only way that they can get the accommodations and supports they need, even to just access virtual instruction, is to enter a school building, almost always in a classroom where there are other students, right? So I've only seen one case around the country where a school has agreed to have one student and one aide in a room. So typically it's like 4 students or even more and 4 adults in a single room, which obviously creates great health risk, much higher risk of transmission. Some are saying, well, we'll give you these supports if you miss out on electives or after school clubs and activities. Or, sometimes they're saying, well, or you can't be included anymore in the general ed setting. You have to, go into this separate classroom or whatever. So, so think about sort of what are students without disabilities, what opportunities and options do they have right now in terms of educational opportunities, and what what are students with disabilities being provided? So they can't, the supports can't be conditioned on removing some of those opportunities. In addition, if a school district, of course, is giving all students the option of coming to school buildings in person or participating virtually, it has to make sure both options are available and accessible to students with disabilities. So it can give students with disability more options. So it can say, yes, we'll open a school building just for students with disabilities who need it, but it can't give them fewer options. So it can't say, you can't do virtual learning, you must come in, if students without disabilities are given both options. So again, yeah, they're legally allowed to offer to provide those in-person supports in a building, but it can't require them to come in as the only way to receive the in-person supports. And the reasoning there is, you might think of the option to come into school as only a benefit, but for students, especially in this category, who are much higher risk of dying from COVID if they get it, that's not a benefit, right? That's essentially handcuffing someone to say, this is the only way we're going to provide your necessary supports, your necessary access supports, is if you put your life at risk, right? And that's especially not a choice if you are not wealthy enough to be able to quit your job to, be your student's unpaid paraprofessional or to hire someone. So it's absolutely not a choice. So in other words, bottom line is that if school districts are placing those kinds of conditions or barriers on students with disabilities to access any kind of virtual education that they're not placing on students without disabilities, that is discrimination. A key part of the ADA is the concept of reasonable modifications, also sometimes called reasonable accommodations. And that basically says that in order to avoid discrimination on the basis of disability, public entities like school districts are required to make reasonable modifications in their policies, practices, or procedures. So the way this might translate into this setting is if a student who falls into this category needs in-person full-time supports just to access virtual learning, we're not talking about in-person instruction, we're just saying same opportunities as other students in your district, the virtual learning, but I need a human being to turn on my iPad and to log me in. That is a reasonable accommodation, especially because the school district in effect acknowledged that already and said, yes, we know you need full-time in-person supports because on your IEP, we provided you a one-to-one aid, or we put you in a setting where you essentially had that anyway in a small classroom setting. So we know that that's a reasonable accommodation. Now, the question is it a reasonable accommodation now, given the public health risks? And we would argue absolutely it's reasonable now for a number of reasons. One, we know how to do this safely. You can provide these in a school building. I would argue that it's nowhere near as safe to do it in a classroom with 3 other students and 3 other adults, most of whom can't wear masks or keep their distance from each other. You could do it in a one-to-one setting in a classroom. You could do it in a community center or a library, or you could do it in the student's home. So we have 8 months now of experience in knowing how to prevent transmission and how to do this safely. And we also know that a number of school districts are doing this. And so there's certainly precedent for this. People know how to do this safely. It's also reasonable because these people are already in these jobs, right? They were already hired for these jobs to be aides. And most of them, at least that I've heard, very few people have been laid off from these jobs. They're still being paid and they're sitting essentially doing, virtual aid support, which is every single person I've heard from is like, this is ridiculous, including the aides. They're like, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be supporting this person. So they're just sitting like watching these Zoom things and maybe doing some stuff, but like they're not really providing the supports that need to be provided. So it is reasonable because districts know how to do this. Some districts are doing this, and we know how to do it safely, and it's far safer I would argue, than what is going on now in terms of the provision of in-person supports, if that's even happening at all, which in many cases it isn't. So there's also some very good communication specific law in the ADA, and that's relevant here. It's in addition to the provisions I've already spoken about in terms of access and reasonable accommodations. But essentially the ADA regulations provide that the school districts have to ensure that students with disabilities have the supports they need to communicate as effectively and to participate as effectively as students without disabilities. So in a virtual learning environment, if the teacher is expecting students without disabilities to comment in the chat box, to participate in spoken class discussions, or to turn in written assignments, the school district has an obligation to ensure that the student with a disability has the supports they need to communicate as effectively as other students in that class. I've just included in blue some of the regulatory language that's in the law, and the toolkit online has much more regulatory and legal language that can be looked at. I took that out of most of these slides, but the legal term of art in the ADA for communication supports is auxiliary aids and services. It's a bit of a mouthful. And that can include really anything. In this context, it absolutely can include an in-person human being if that's what's necessary to ensure that the AAC user is able to participate and communicate effectively. And remember, the communication is both receptive and expressive. So if they need support to listen or to read or understand, that is a communication support as well. Auxiliary aids and services I have sort of down here in a footnote is it can also include a wide range of other tools and accommodations that might be necessary. I've heard of several examples of where a certain virtual platform that a school district may be using is completely inaccessible for some people. So in my own district, I know that they're providing Zoom as an alternative to Teams for students who are deaf, because Teams is not accessible for them. So they are using Zoom for some students. So that's one example. And of course, AAC devices would be, another example of an auxiliary aid or service that might need to be provided. So in the communication specific, the law, the ADA does contemplate that the family can agree to provide those supports in certain circumstances, but the school cannot require the family to pay for those supports. So the family could say, yes, we found someone who's really great, who's already trained in, if you have a training issue or whatever, we know this one person, we have found this person, and we're willing to supply, find the human being who can play this role, but you're going to have to, pay for it. Like, we can't afford it or whatever. I mean, it's just on the district to ensure that it's free. So again, yeah, and if it's a neighbor or if it's a parent or a guardian or attendant or whatever, the district has to offer to reimburse the family for providing that service. They can't place a surcharge or impose a cost on the student or the family of the student with disabilities. So in some, like on the health risk bit, if a school district is not requiring students without disabilities to take those additional health risks to access their education, then again, it cannot impose that extra burden on students with disabilities to access their education. So, and again, this is especially true when so many students in this category face these higher risks of complications from COVID-19, and they're, due to their disabilities, are unable to wear masks for longer than a few minutes, or to take other and observe other hygiene and safety protocols. So again, looking to the comparing of how students with disabilities and students without disabilities are being treated and what kind of risks they're being asked to incur to access an education, it's absolutely discriminatory to require students with disabilities to take extra steps to place their health at risk to access the same educational opportunities. So in other words, the example here is a lot of school districts are all virtual for everyone, but they're saying, okay, well, we have a a tier of students that has they acknowledge that these are students who need full-time in-person supports to access virtual learning. In fact, you see that in writing. They will acknowledge that and they say, okay, we're only bringing back, 1% of our school district. Those are students who really need full-time in-person supports to access virtual learning. But they're saying the only way that you're going to be able to access virtual learning to get those supports is if you come into the school building and sit in a classroom with 3 other people and 4 other adults, ride the school bus, and incur substantial additional health risks that you wouldn't be occurring if you had the legitimate option, like your neighbor who's not disabled, to participate virtually in school. Now, a lot of people want this and are happy with the risk, and I'm not judging that at all. That's fine. But there are a ton of people in this category who aren't comfortable with that, who are at higher risk. And the point here is really to just point out that there is certainly a legal argument here that can be made to ensure that students with significant disabilities who need full-time in-person supports can and should be able to safely access their education by getting these in-person supports if they still need them, if they need them during the pandemic.
While you're just taking a quick moment, I'm getting some messages in Spanish in the chat that the translation feature or the interpretation is not currently working. Lorna, just want to check in with you real quick on that. Okay, so could you just say in Spanish to remind people to select the Spanish language? Thank you. Okay, so if people who are looking to use the Spanish interpretation, if you could please, okay, it looks like it's been fixed. All right, keep going. Thanks, sorry about that, Donna.
Sure, I'm almost done. So, just in terms of putting this into the reasonable accommodations terminology, a reasonable accommodation for a student who can't rely on speech to communicate, who needs physical in-person supports to access virtual learning, is the safe in-person presence of an adult who can't support those access needs. So that's a reasonable accommodation. It can also be framed as, an effective communication auxiliary aid or service. So there's sort of 2 avenues under the ADA for requesting this and for getting it. So I'm not a litigator. I have engaged in litigation, but I'm not a litigator. I don't have that sort of tendency. I'm very much a sort of practical, can do, like, let's think outside the box, let's be creative. How do we solve this issue? And so we've been doing a lot of we've got a survey going right now to try to get examples from around the country of how students are being supported, how they're not being supported, but, just ideas. And so, just thinking practically, we do know that there are districts who are taking this approach and are like, we know that these students need in-person supports. Let's figure this out, right? This is a pandemic, right? Like, this is not business as usual. Like we have to change how we're doing everything, right? And, I think that's true with regard to all students, of course. But these are students who have very significant support needs, who are not getting any kind of education right now due to no fault of their own, right? So the the creative sort of approaches where students' needs are being met are like, we know how to be safe about this, right? So we also know that there are a lot of paraprofessionals, aides, that have already been working with certain students who have told the families, I don't want to go into a school building. I don't want to take that risk. I would far prefer to come to your house, right? Or if the family's not comfortable with that, then you could go to a community center and have a dedicated room for a pair or whatever. But really to enter a family bubble. So we know this concept, right? Like, you quarantine for 14 days, then you merge your bubble, the spouses or the kids or whatever, you're all in the single bubble. One person does all the grocery shopping for the whole bubble. We know how to be safe, right? We know how to limit transition. And this is to get through this, probably another year of this or whatever, until children, especially vaccines have not been tested on children. It's going to be a long time before students have access to vaccines. you know, we're in this for the long haul, but this is a practical solution, right? So paraprofessionals do want to work and they want to support these families in many cases. So there are realistic, practical ways to address this issue that are far safer, in my opinion, than what schools are providing at this time. With regard to sending the person to the home, you know, that is a potential solution, I guess, for families that have at least one parent or adult family member who works from home, who can sort of supervise and work within earshot to ensure safety. But again, you know, if you go to a library or community center or classroom, you know, you could have pairs, one pair per classroom dedicated to that pair, someone sort of roaming the hallways periodically to check in to make sure everyone is safe at all times. And as I said, we're hearing repeatedly, I've heard dozens of stories from around the country where assistants have already communicated to the families that they would love to do this, right? They would love to come to this family's home and form a bubble and be safe, and people wouldn't have to wear masks in that situation, and you're in that bubble. But you know, every circumstance obviously is different. So this has to be an individualized sort of determination and discussion and creative solution. And I don't think this is happening enough. And I have great confidence that we can do better in this country in terms of supporting these students. So basically, quick takeaways: if a school district is providing remote or virtual learning opportunities to any student, then the ADA requires it to make sure that students with disabilities are able to fully and safely access those opportunities. If they need those in-person supports just to turn on their tablet, the district has to provide those supports. They can either send their own staff in, or, you know, as an alternative, if they're not willing to do that or not able to, they would be required to reimburse the student's family if they're able to provide those supports as a secondary reasonable accommodation. And it just, in some, it cannot require students with disabilities to condition their health, to risk their health on getting those supports by forcing them to come into a school building as the only way to receive the accommodation. Of course, if you're comfortable with that, if the student's comfortable with that, if the school is comfortable with that, great. This population in particular is at much, much higher risk of COVID complications and death, and can't take, many of them cannot take those steps of wearing PPE and following hygiene protocols. So I've just included our email address and website here at the end, and on the website you can access the full toolkit. I'm happy to take questions now or after Tamor.
Yeah, let's continue on with Tamor, because I think that you will both be able to sort of riff off of each other for the answers to, there's a bunch of questions that I'm logging and we'll have them for after both of you speak. So that was amazing, Tana, amazing. I was texting with my staff saying, everybody needs to watch this. We need to promote this everywhere because it's so good. So now we're going to move to what's happening here in California specifically. And Tamor Ravandi works with is an attorney with Disability Rights California, who is our partner in these efforts around communication access. And we are really, really pleased, and we're so happy you're joining us. Take it away, Tamor. Tamor, are you there? Oh, you are still muted, Tamor.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Okay. You're great.
Thanks. I'm going to talk to you about special education and a law called IDEA. There are two federal laws. You just heard about the ADA. The other law is called IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. My computer is making some noises, so just bear with me. To begin with, I've sent you various little pieces of information that I want to explain a little bit about them. I've given you a short outline that I will use to talk to you today. I've given you a little bit more information, but a number of questions and answers from one of our manuals. called Special Education Rights and Responsibilities, based on what I thought you would like to hear today. And I also had a short piece translated from California Department of Education talking about current situation in California.
Tamar, I'm sorry to interrupt, but have you selected English as your channel?
No, I don't know.
If it's possible to do that, if not, then my suggestion to everyone is to make sure that you, to hear Tamar, you will actually have to go back in and click unmute original audio, and that is the way you will be able to hear Tamar.
It would be good if they do that because my computer plays all kinds of games with me.
Okay, all right, go ahead. Keep going, keep on going, Tamar.
Just if we are not making progress, just let me know.
I will. Okay.
It's important for a couple of things I wanted for you to know that a small piece from our manual is a very, very small piece of the manual. It's a book in 15, 16 chapters, and it's a very good resource for all kinds of needs you may have throughout special education issues and processes. So I selected a few questions and answers for you based on what I understood you may be interested this afternoon. I also sent to Judy and other folks a link to our page for coronavirus page, the COVID-19 page on special education. On this page, we have talked about various issues from California Department of Education and, more importantly, US Department of Education in the last few months. And I understand most materials on that page have been translated. So it's very important for you to visit that page from time to time to make sure you have the most recent information on what we have to say. The good news about special education is that the law has not changed. And that's why I wanted to give you this outline and go through it with you, and then highlight it in regard to what you may be experiencing during the pandemic. And I have tried to put some keywords, key language in various lines of this little short outline that I would highlight. And then when we get to the issues that you are maybe more concerned about, I want to hear more questions directly from you, then I will answer them. So first and foremost, as I said, the law has not changed. What does that mean? It means that all the procedural and substantive rights remain. In California, for a short while, assessment timelines were suspended in special education. That is no longer the case. So all rights have been restored, and under federal law, nothing changed anyway. The main thing is to understand what special education is. Special education is instruction and services designed to meet the students' unique needs. These are key words in special education. We get to the word IEP, and you're all familiar with IEP, but every IEP should have goals and then services. Goals deal with really the issue of instruction, how a child or a student can access information based on their unique needs. These are key words because in your advocacy, whether it will be under IDEA, and eventually if you go to the ADA, these will be important conversations between you and the district. And if you go to court, the court, because the school must first determine what the child's unique needs are. As I listen to the conversation today, I suspect a unique need of a lot of students in the population of the people I'm talking to today is speech, various degrees of speech needs. So that should already be identified. and the pandemic hasn't changed it, nor has the law required that to change. So that's important, right? Before March 2020, your school district identified a speech need, and since then, the need hasn't changed. Based on that need, the school still has, throughout the last 6 months, 7 months, the obligation to provide instruction and services related to the speech needs of that student. So when you are advocating and getting a pushback from the school, it is important for you to remind the school that the school must still go back to what the law requires. We start with the unique needs. Nothing has changed. If anything, things may have become more intensified. And now the school must provide, through instruction and services, how to address that need.
The unique needs of a two. Special education must be
the most important part of a unique need is the fact this identification of a unique needs must have some kind of an action attached to it. It means that it should be the program that the school must provide to the student must be individually appropriate. Appropriate is the most important part of special education. And appropriate for every student is different. But essentially it means that the student must receive meaningful educational benefit. Now, educational benefit is not a high standard, but it's not an extremely low standard. So the word meaningful is an important part of that definition, is that we cannot necessarily say here that my child or my student or whoever we're advocating on behalf of requires such and such to get the best education. So long as the student is receiving educational benefit from a goal, from an IEP, and that benefit is meaningful. Now, these are very qualitative words, but at some point, if you get to it before a judge, all these things have significance, and the person who helps you take your case to the hearing will focus on these issues. I heard earlier about the success and the challenges of one of our presenters about accessing and getting benefit from his program. Well, it seemed to me, in some respect, he was getting an educational benefit. And in some respect, that benefit may not be as meaningful or meaningful enough as his IEP may have defined it. So it's so important to go back to that IEP, to that unique identification of unique needs, and look at how we define, for example, or how the school and parents discuss the speech need of a student. So it's not sufficient just to identify a speech disability or a communication barrier, but really define the details of where the need is for this year or whatever the program period is, for usually from beginning to the end of the school year. Now we are into 2021 school year. Our problem started in 2019-20 school year. That particular school year we had, as I said in the next outline,
the student should receive meaningful /is program 3. The program should be written out in a document.
The program is in a document called an IEP. And that document is so important, because that's where we not only find the unique needs, but we understand what that uniqueness is for that particular school year, for that particular period of time. The school has a legal obligation to address. Naturally, the school has an obligation to change that if things change, circumstances change, and especially as the New Year's comes by. We know with the pandemic, things changed. Here's where the important issue about an IEP is. In most situations, here the school had an obligation back in March or April to have a new meeting with parents, what we call an IEP meeting, to look at how the new circumstances would impact access to instruction and services, now that we knew what the unique needs were at the time. What did the law do at that time? Because of state orders in most cases, because it's in the United States, we have a federal system and the states make a lot of decisions, especially on healthcare issues. And in California, we had a directive from the governor about very strict order at the beginning about almost a lockdown type of shelter in place type order at the beginning. Now that prompted the distance learning phase that has continued to this day in some fashion. So what did that do in some sense? That forced everyone to go into this distance learning. And in special education, in language, it changed almost the law by governor's order. It changed every student's placement, right? It changed, in most cases, the placement was in a classroom or in some sort of, well, always a classroom, whether it was a special day classroom or it was a general education classroom or some combination in between. That changed by a order of the state, not the special education law. Now, I don't think we are in a situation to challenge that because I think healthcare issues of that nature will probably prevail anyway. But we know that because of that change, the entire program of a student will have to be reviewed. So if you have an IEP and had an IEP in March of 2020, I'm hoping that each and every student with an IEP, their parents got a notice of some sort of an IEP meeting, which to my knowledge all took place online. A few took place in person back in March or April, but most of the students should have had some sort of an IEP meeting to look at what do we do in these circumstances. Now, I understand things were very hectic and parents probably agreed to all kinds of things that they, now looking back at it, they shouldn't have. I understand that. And maybe the school district would have offered a different set of services. And at the time, nobody knew how long this distance learning was going to take place. And the most, one of those services that I think that you all probably are all talking about even now is the need for a paraprofessional, an aide. So in special education, next to what we call services, I call instruction services. Another term for services is in special education, we call it related services. And related services is a very general, broad language. I've given you just a few examples. There are occupational, physical, speech therapy, assistive technology, and paraprofessional aid, which I know are of interest to you. Assistive technology is a language very, very broad. The definition is extremely generous, and it allows not only for AAC or any type of communication device that you may be having a need for, but also all the other technologies that distance learning may have necessitated. I'm not quite sure, based on my experience, that every IEP addressed these additional technology needs. So one area of comments and questions I've been getting in the last few months, and when I have talked to parents, I have discovered that a part of the conversation that didn't take place back in March or April or since then is the additional needs for technology to support a student in distance learning. And that was perhaps some of it could have been internet enhancement, and some of it could have been more a better type of technology, much more powerful than one would possibly need in class and so forth. There was no even an assessment to find out what the student needed at that time or needs now. And the second issue is a much thornier issue of aid. The person in all circumstances that that I am aware of, in similar to the situation that you guys are faced with, is the need for someone to be present with a student in the classroom. Now, when you had your IEP meetings in March and April, you may have unintentionally agreed to something that changed that need that you previously had agreed to. Because the school may have told you, we don't have someone to come to your home. And they still do so. And in most cases, they may have a point. Nonetheless, if the student's needs didn't change because they moved into, they got their instruction at home, as I understand it, in many cases, the need in fact increased rather than decrease, then if that modification probably was the wrong offer from the district to you, and even if you have accepted it, you should know that legally, just because you accept the wrong offer, it doesn't mean that you cannot go back and say, I was wrong. I should never have accepted that, because you should never have offered this service to me. For example, take the aid off my my child's IEP, or modify it in any shape or form, or say that you could provide the same aid through online, some sort of online platform. I have clients who have an aid assisting them as they are attending for example, an online program. They have a separate online channel, or however it's actually taking place, that the aid through some sort of online communication is assisting the student. My report from the parents I've talked with, that has had some success and a lot of problems at the same time. That there are things the aid can do with the student online, but without the help of the parent in many ways to set up the equipment, in many other situations, especially behavioral issues, and I would imagine some health and physical issues, without the help of the parent at home, none of the other support that the school has been offering would have even made sense, even though the help through an aid help through an online support has been to some extent useful. So
1. Student achieve the goals written in 2. Occupation and number 3. Home instruction.
I put on my outline home instruction. I put that on my outline home instruction because home instruction is very similar to distance learning in some sense. Home instruction is not new in special education. a student can get their education at home even before the pandemic because because of many different reasons. Temporary health issues, permanent health issues, or long-term, or disability issues that are so complicated that would require home instruction. There is no question in any of those situations. So let's go back to before the pandemic. Before we didn't have any concerns about transmission of a virus. There was no question if the student needed an aid at home, that aid should have been included in the IEP, and that aid should have come into the student's home. There was no question about that then. And since the law hasn't changed, there's no question about it now. Now, what changes in the meantime is the fact that we have state or local health instructions that could provide either a legal justification for schools or justifiably a justifiable reason for them to say for the foreseeable future, we're not going to be able to send someone to your home because we're under this order or that order by the local county or by our county or by a state health official. This is where it's complicating the conversation today. So in terms of the law hasn't changed. The student who is getting distance learning is very much in a similar situation to a student who always received their instruction at home through an IEP. And in that situation, if the person needed an aid, either for academics or for health or for communication or physical mobility, that person would receive their aid paid by the school before, and they should receive it now. The complication is what happens in the situation where everyone is conscious of lawsuits and the fact that the virus has a dangerous component. People can get sick. The student can get sick. The aide can get sick. Other people in the home can get sick, and that sickness can be mild or can be very, very tragic. As a consequence, the schools have been very, very, very reluctant in agreeing to send people of their own staff, people who are employees of the school district, to students' homes.
1. Receive special 2. During home install necessary equipment 3. This includes related variable IVP rights of 1, 2. Receiving and 3 and 1. The scope of essential workers include.
I want to bring, I gave you on this outline some information on the rights of parents with limited English proficiency. But if you go past that, I want to bring your attention to two things I put on that outline. Even under situations where we have strict health directives from the state, essential workers have always been exempt from this very, very, strict and stringent prohibition. And the definition of essential workers that the state uses includes people who work and assist students in the learning process. This really opens the door for advocacy in many ways to define the person or persons you need to come and assist your child, your son, your daughter, as potentially an essential worker, exempt from the health prohibition of the state. I'm not saying that happens in every situation. Depends on what that person is going to do for the student. But it is very possible in some of the cases I've looked at that the aid on the IEP can be defined as an essential worker. And in those cases, I cannot imagine what the excuse the school may have to provide the aid at home. But even if the student's need is not that will be defined under an essential worker scope of duties, still if the aid remains on the IEP, then the school is responsible. The school's answer to you generally is, I cannot take the legal risk of sending my employees to your home, somebody getting coronavirus, either my aide or you, someone in your home, and then I will be faced with lawsuits as a consequence of that decision. That's their argument. I'm hearing that every day. I'm hearing that all the time. So there have been a couple of solutions or issues that have come up to address that. The first thing the schools have done or at least actually both have happened at the same time, is that instead of using their own employees, aides and paraprofessionals that are on their payroll who are hired by the school districts have either contracted with, which I'm not sure that will immunize them necessarily, but more preferably, they're entering parents, entering into agreements with parents, what we call a settlement agreement, a legal contract with parents, giving parents the money to contract directly with private entities. And there are many of them in California who are willing to accept the money and come into your home and provide the service. So school districts do understand that regardless of the fact that they cannot or are not sending aids to your home or providing some sort of a direct assistance, whether it could be an aide or could be the special education teacher, or could be the OT, occupational therapist, or the speech therapist. It's just not only the aide, it could be any number of other situations. That responsibility hasn't gone away. And the way they are addressing that, in order for you not to sue them one day soon, is that they're encouraging parents to accept these legal contracts. And parents have accepted them in most cases that I know of. And they accept these agreements under which they have a pot of money, and parents directly contract with either non-public agencies or similar private entities that would accept the money. They have very strict rules about how to come into someone's home, how to provide a service, or how to provide a service in an alternate place and be able to provide the service. And almost all of these contracts also have a disclaimer clause. And the disclaimer clause is new, and the school district would not agree to a legal contract without it. And the disclaimer is that you agree that you will not hold school districts responsible for any type of condition that may take place, like if kind of a infection that may take place as a consequence of you making your own individual contracts with a provider, a speech therapist, or a non-public agency for any particular reason. So what is very clear is the school districts are trying to comply with the law, but in a way that protects them legally from much bigger lawsuit than a special education lawsuit. What they seem to be very, very concerned about, and perhaps even scared, is this sort of other lawsuit that you may bring or a provider may bring against them for much more significant lawsuit of health risk to them if somebody gets the virus and something very, very bad happens. So with that, I wanted to bring also to your attention that just about a couple of months ago, California passed a new law. I don't think this law adds anything specific to the depth of the requirements and duties of their school district, but I think it's helpful that it's there now. And this new law, the special education law, now says that when a student must receive his or her IEP under an emergency condition, when the school closure happens for more than 10 days, then the IEP must specify the means by which the student receives their IEP. I honestly don't think it adds anything more than what I just mentioned. That's why I've left it here at the end. But it's an important recognition in the state that, or there has been some pressure to add that to make schools understand that don't pay attention to the overall responsibilities you have. And just because of the pandemic, you may not just now use the pandemic as a means of saying we have health directions and directives and we cannot satisfy your IEP. Now, if the school districts told you that, and if they tell you that, that would be an incorrect statement. But at least this law, the new law in California, helps make the point directly to school districts that you have an ongoing obligation. Make sure that you meet your every time the schools close for more than 10 days as a result of a health emergency order, that you look at the IEP and amend it and put in the IEP specific language of how you're going to address the students' needs going forward. I hope that gives you enough information about what the status of things are right now. It is important for you to know that IDEA is a federal law. And since that law defines the students' needs very specifically, it is a powerful law in the sense that you just heard about the ADA. ADA is about a comparison between students with and without disabilities. IDEA comes in and defines the unique needs of a student. That has implications for both laws because it's far more specific, and that definiteness, that clear definition of needs and how the school must address them really has implication for both laws, but specifically for the IDEA. So I stop here now and wait for your questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Timur. That was just a wealth of information. I just want to apologize to everybody that we are unable to get Timur's materials into the chat to share with you. But I want to promise everybody that after this webinar gets uploaded onto our YouTube page, we're going to place Timur's materials from DRC, the communication first materials that Tana presented, and their toolkit, as well as other information in 3 different places that you will be able to find it. First, you'll be able to find it generally on our Disability Voices United website. That's disabilityvoicesunited.org. Second, you will be able to find it on our COVID-19 resources page, which you can find if you go to our website. You can look under resources for coronavirus, and we have a very, very extensive page on all kinds of materials that deal with everything from access to healthcare to reducing stress and anxiety to your rights to regional center services and education on our pages for our COVID-19 resources website. The third place we're going to put it is something I just want to spend 30 seconds telling you about. We have something that we call the interchange. You find it at easily theinterchange.org. We have 2 interchanges. You'll see that they're being placed in the links in the chat. The links are there. And if you go to theinterchange.org, you will see that we have an interchange on self-determination and another one on communication access. And if you go to the one on communication access, we will have it placed on the main page there as well. So I'm now going to turn to Q&A for our last few minutes. There's a bunch of questions that I want to present. Timur, I just want to give you a heads up that I muted you, so you will need to unmute to answer these questions. Okay, Timur? Okay.
Sure.
Perfect. The first is a question that I know there's been a couple of questions that have already been answered within the chat, but I wanted everybody, particularly those on Facebook, to be able to get a chance to hear the answer. So one question is, what recommendation can you give to older students, 18-year-olds, who just started an adult transition program with the school district and wants to get AAC speech services and parent training? Do they still offer these services for adult transition students who have never started AAC before? So that, Tana, you had already answered that, and then we'll go to Timur if he wants to add something.
You want me to read what I wrote?
Sure.
My response was, as long as the student is still covered under IDEA, the district is responsible for addressing communication needs through evaluations and services.
Yeah, so the point is that if it doesn't really matter if they're an adult and over the age of 18, if they still have an IEP with the school district is still responsible for providing those services. And William is a very prime example of that. Timur, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
No, I guess except that the age is maximum age when a student turns 22.
Right. So when a student turns 22, they either graduate or age out of the school system. And but certainly at the age of 18, you could also be asking your regional centers for some of these supports as well. Michelle or William, did you want to add anything about sort of the difficulty of getting some of these services and supports through a transition program?
So we're just starting our transitioning IEP when COVID hit. So we didn't have that benefit, but as part of, just who I am, we live in California, so every state is a little bit different, but you can ask your ARC. In California, we have Department of Rehab, and we utilized a program actually called, Voice Options. And you have to have a speech pathologist or a educational professional write the recommendation that there's a need for the individual. and it's a grant program. So I linked an article to how to get an iPad funded from TACA, the Autism Community in Action, in the chat. You can go in that article, and at the bottom, it's certainly not comprehensive, but there are some grants, just to give you an idea of maybe types of internet hits that you might get on grants and options for devices, or perhaps even some funding, and regional center too, as you mentioned, if the consumer is regional center qualified.
Mhm. So while I have you, Michelle, there was a question that you answered in the chat that I just want to bring up for everybody. When you had the AAC assessment done, who funded it?
So we've done it both ways. We have done our own private assessment because we were pursuing that with our district through the IEP process. So we wanted to fund our own. But we've also asked the district to fund it. And then we did exercise our right to requesting an IEE because we disagreed with the district's assessment. So there's a few options families have for those.
Great.
In California, even Medi-Cal covers AAC now. It's been a while, long time ago. So just that one more option.
That's great.
Correct. I should mention that too. If you are a regional center consumer, you can, whether you have a financial need in your family or not, you can utilize the Medi-Cal waiver as a regional center consumer, and that would qualify you for Medi-Cal because it's based on disability for the individual.
Wonderful. Here's a question from Otto, who is a typer himself. He asked in the chat, is there ever a precedent for where a parent is monetarily compensated as the paraprofessional? Tana, have you ever heard of that, or Timur?
Yeah, well, I don't see why not. I mean, it's no different from the situation where parents used to provide transportation, and the schools always agree to reimburse them. So I think that is legitimate. Remember that even paraprofessionals must have training, because the school district is, every provider in IEP legally must be qualified. And of course, for an aide, we don't have a definition of qualified, except we know that person should be qualified. But as long as the team defines what qualified means for an aide, and parents can meet that requirement or get the training they need, usually through a couple of hours of assistance from the school or whoever will be supervising, yes. I just want to add that at that point, that parent will probably have to be supervised by someone by the school to ensure whatever the supervision requirements they have for an aide.
Thank you. Tana, have you heard about that?
I haven't heard of anyone actually getting paid right now to do this during the pandemic. I have heard of parents being paid as paraprofessionals going into schools before the pandemic. But I am suggesting, as I did in the presentation, that if a parent is the only solution or the only practical solution to being the student's aid, that absolutely there is a legal basis for having the school pay that adult to provide that service that they are required to provide. So there's no legal bar to that. But the question was, is there a precedent? And during the pandemic, I cannot think of any single example where an actual parent is being provided, that I've heard of, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, is providing that service. I do know of other situations where a private person that the family has hired has been paid, by the school district. So
that's good.
Can I just, before you go to the next question, Judy?
Yeah, go ahead.
William or Michelle had mentioned that there were HIPAA concerns or something with seeing the other people. And I'm just flabbergasted by that. First of all, like, schools generally are not covered by HIPAA. They're not HIPAA covered entities, and you hear them using it as a weapon all the time to prevent inclusion, or like, I mean, it's just, I'm just astounded by that, and I'd love to hear more offline. I don't need to take up time now, but I just wanted to point that out, that that's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I forgot to say that triggered something when you said, when I heard that as well. I mean, HIPAA is for healthcare, and schools are not healthcare agencies. They're not doctors, they're not hospitals. So, I mean, regional centers, by the way, also like to use the HIPAA thing as a weapon against us. And they are also not required to follow HIPAA. They may have other privacy concerns maybe within the Lanterman Act, but definitely not HIPAA. So, so that is something, and I have to tell you, I know a lot of students right now who are seeing all the other students in the class in their school district. So I have no idea what your school is talking about, but I would definitely challenge that.
But that's another thing too, is like in the normal, like there's no expectation of privacy in the class. I mean, there's very clear case law on that. So if you're physically together, there's no privacy anything, right? So if there's stuff going on in the background, yes, there's some privacy issues there, but there's really, I mean, even like FERPA, like someone raised that, like that again is not like, there's really no basis for hiding other students' faces. I mean, if a student says, I don't want my camera on because I've got stuff going on in the background that other people can't see, yes, but not preventing other people from being visible, right? So.
Yeah, and I have to say that I'm a professor at UCLA, and we are having to teach everything online right now, and I'm requiring my students to have their cameras on so that I can see visually that they're paying attention. And I have had circumstances where students said, listen, I share a room with like 4 other people and they're running around. I'll only turn it on when I'm asking a question, and that's fine. But so I know that that is just not the case. Do you want to add anything, Michelle?
Yeah, a couple of things that may or may not make a difference, because I still, something we're going to be discussing with our team, but William is a virtual student and the other students are in class. And he's also at a non-public school.
Well, then they're definitely not subject to HIPAA. They're not even a public school.
Unless it was a hospital or something, but yeah, that's, yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
No, that wouldn't change my analysis.
I agree, but we'll discuss that with them. But yeah, just wanted to bring that up in case it did make a difference, but I didn't think it did. Thank you.
There is a question, Lorna, in the Q&A that I would love for you to translate by Rafael Ojeda Gallegos. I'm not sure if you can see it, Lorna. That's probably a Michelle question. I don't know, Tana, if you want to weigh in, what kind of iPad would you recommend for him? He gets very frustrated.
So communication first does not actually ever recommend any kind of AAC. We are completely agnostic and neutral on AAC. All we care about is access to effective AAC. So I can't answer that.
To that point, I shared an article just on how to get an iPad funded, and we're going through the process of either through insurance, Medi-Cal, or asking your school district. It's from the Autism Community and Actions website, tacanow.org. For Spanish, if you access from a computer, you can choose a drop down to translate the article into Spanish. It may not be a perfect translation, but it may give her some insight as to how to go about requesting an AAC evaluation.
Yes, and I'll just mention that if your child is a regional center consumer, the regional center also can provide an AAC evaluation. There are various agencies that exist. Certainly, I know there are several in Southern California, and what they would do, I mean, I don't know what they would do during COVID, honestly, but normally you would go down to their place and they would have like 10 different devices, and they'll even let you check out some of the devices and experiment with them to see which one you're comfortable with. So we don't want to recommend anything specific. However, what we would recommend is that you try lots of different kinds and see which one works best for you. Okay. While I have you, Lorna, can you, Maria Rodriguez has another question in Spanish, please.
I can answer that, but Tamar, do you want to take a stab first?
What's the question, Judy?
Annabella, do you mind just summarizing it again, please?
When you just read it out, that's fine.
Alt tab, post attendee dash Zoom dash
Yeah.
tab.
And this is certainly a problem I've heard before, Tamar, that, you know, when students go into the transition program, all academics are out the window, and the only thing that they focus on are like cooking skills and mobility skills and
Yeah.
those kinds of things, and academics are out. So what would you suggest?
Well, no, I mean, you're right. That's what happens, and there's nothing in the law that says that. We know of only one legal requirement, that if the student does not have a regular diploma, eligibility continues until age 22. That's the only legal requirement. There is nothing in the law says after a certain age, academics stop and only transition will continue. This is a sort of creation of the school districts over time. Very, very challengeable, especially if the student had a pretty good IEP with academics before he or she turned 18 and on. That's a pretty good evidence that academics was important and the student was making progress. So the bottom line is that it happens all the time, and there's no legal basis for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, I know of people who have stretched out meeting the requirements of the diploma. So they've taken sort of like a modified schedule to stretch out so they don't get their diploma till they're 22 and take dual enroll classes at a community college and are supported throughout all that. So it's only academics that they're getting all the related services, and they get their regular diploma at 22 instead of 18, so that they can get, and then along the way they're getting other stuff too, but that's their transition as college essentially.
Thank you. Here's a question. So many, but this is from Darlene Hansen, who is our resident AAC specialist who works with DBU. So many families have been told that the IEP is written for in school, and I'm putting up quotes, air quotes right now, in school as always. New different needs are not written into the IEP. So, you know, what would you recommend, Tamar, for these families who are being told there's nothing we can do at all for you?
No. So on an IEP, there is a section called placement. Placement is never says only in school. It just says the environment, the setting in which the educational, the rest of the IEP should be implemented. We know that because of this pandemic, in some situations, the actual placement is not possible. That doesn't mean the school does not have another, the rest of what we call the continuum of placement options available to it. It could be, it could be some sort of in-person and some out-of-school services. At the end of the day, in an IEP, the most important part of an IEP are those goals. And that's why often we see very few goals on an IEP, because that's where the sort of kind of all the rest of the legal duties and obligations the school will flow from. If you have only one goal on an IEP, which says the student should accomplish such and such on his speech needs, that may be able to be met pretty easily in many different ways, including through a virtual medium. But if you probably have, which is more typical, 4, 5, 6, 10, or 12 different goals, those goals will have to be accomplished. And the placement was decided after the fact. Now, if the placement didn't become, just because it became unavailable, it doesn't mean the goals should not be met, if that helps. That's how the best way to look at it. So if the school says, well, it would be no different than the school says, well, that particular school, it doesn't exist anymore. Something happened to it. Well, it doesn't have, yes, it went away, but the actual IEP has not disappeared, and it remains the same as before.
I'll just add too that placement is rarely like this school building, you know, Belvedere, whatever, right? It's general education setting or special education setting typically, right? And when you're participating in virtual instruction with your class in a general education setting, like placement has not changed. And I know some states have taken different positions on this, but I think the feds have come out and said placement is not changing if you're doing it virtually. So like many school districts are not revising IEPs at all. They're just implementing as much as they can from them.
I mean, so for some students that may be the case, but again, for many, I would imagine for most students, that argument is pretty weak. But it may be in some situations, a virtual attendance is pretty similar for a student with very limited learning disability. Who knows? I'm not
saying there's not a need for different accommodations. I'm saying that the placement has not changed. If you are if you are participating in virtual learning, like, so let's say one of our students is fully included in the regular education setting, and they are now participating in a virtual setting with 20 other kids who don't have disabilities, that is still a regular education placement.
Yes.
Right. It would only be different if they were going into a school building with, you know, like what I referred to earlier is like, we're only going to give you supports if you go into this building and sit with 3 other students with disabilities and get your instruction from a special education teacher. I mean, that would be a change of placement. But if you're participating virtually and your placement hasn't changed, I mean, that seems fairly clear. I mean, most governments that I've seen have taken that position.
Well, I think my position would be that you look at the IEP very closely. That yes, I think in many cases, I see why you're making that argument against this sort of absurd argument by school districts just because you're not in school anymore. The IEP was for in school. That argument is so weak, I wouldn't even pay too much attention to it. I just want you to know that I mean, attendance virtually is not the same as attending in person. So for a lot of students, that placement has changed in many ways. So I think you would have to look at the entire IEP to make that decision.
Yeah, I think it comes down to accommodations. So, yeah.
So we're going to take our last question right now. I know that we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to take one more question because I want to make sure to get the answer. A speech therapist at the school wants me, the parent, to train my child with AAC. But I could not do it because I am overwhelmed taking care of my child and attending to her personal needs, as well as dealing with her behavior. What should I do?
Well, I think it's kind of runs along what we both, Tana and I, have been saying from different angles. From an IEP angle, there's no justification for that whatsoever. You wouldn't find anything probably on your child's IEP that gives you that obligation. There's nothing under the IDEA that gives you that obligation to help the school meet its duties and obligations under the IDEA. So for them to say, you teach your student, your child, the AAC that we agreed to provide, I think that should be, you should be able to take care of that by a letter or an email to the special ed director, I would imagine.
Yeah, you definitely need to fight that. Okay, just one last request from a parent is it really needs to find a resource for finding a speech therapist who focuses on AAC. I know that we have a few actually listening in right now. So if folks could, if you know of maybe if there's a list, or if, I know that we looked at that, if you looked at wellspring.org and the iask.org, we're putting those resources in the chat right now. And you should be able to go in there and look to see where you can find individuals who can train both person to type to communicate, as well as work with training communication partners and potentially even helping you identify communication partners. So with that, I would just want to thank our amazing presenters. This was such a great webinar. And so I was going to say it was timely, but it's like it was timely like in April, and it'll sadly remain timely for potentially the rest of this school year. So I want to thank, first of all, William, who's amazing and wearing a great Communication First shirt, and Michelle Del Rosario for your great and important putting a human face to this, to what we're talking about here, as well as Tana and Tamor for your legal and expertise. This was a fantastic webinar. As we've been saying in the chat, all of this information will be up in 3 places on our website, the interchange.org, our communication interchange, as well as our coronavirus resources website, as well as our general website, which has links to both of those sub-websites. So once again, thank you, everybody. Have a really wonderful and safe Thanksgiving. Stay with your pod or stay outdoors and 6 feet away from other people.
And thanks for your simultaneous interpretation. That was great.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much,
everybody.
Judy, for organizing and hosting this. Is very
Thank you. And thank you to Nina Spiegelman, who's the head of ours, and to Megan, who run our project on communication access, and to Ed Herzl, our our program assistant. So thank you, everybody, and stay safe out there. Happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.